Hey everybody, welcome in. This is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV. We're going to be doing our live show today where basically I'm going to break down some of the most important cases in policing. Now, there have been a couple pretty controversial cases that I'm going to get into, and I don't want to exaggerate, but there was a case that happened in the last couple days, and I've actually gotten more hate, more engagement, just more overall interest, even though most of the people are disagreeing with me about an officer involved shooting that happened a couple days ago. So, I'm going to lead with that case here in a minute, and I did advertise this on some of my other social media platforms, so it's very possible that we might get some other people in. And for those who are new to the show, one of the things that I like to do is I like to have engagement. So while I'm going through some of these cases, especially this first one I'll talk about here in a few minutes, that if you disagree with what I'm saying, definitely go ahead and put it in the chat, because having a discussion, a dialogue, a debate about really important police issues, I think that's important to do. And so for those of you who don't know, we usually do this show we always do this show on Fridays, and we usually do it here around lunchtime. And, usually I'm pretty hungry, and, we usually here as a team either get lunch right before or afterwards. And, speaking of digestive issues, this is caused by a potential toxin that's in all of the quote unquote healthy foods, that scientists have been telling us to eat with a fraudulent food pyramid. I mean, just for the longest time. And this potential toxin causes digestive issues. And according to Dr. Gundry, who's a world-renowned cardiologist, this is actually affecting millions of people nationwide. Some of the warning signs include weight gain and fatigue and digestive discomfort and stiff joints. Even skin problems. Well, it's important to know that Dr. Gundry explains these side effects are often mistaken for normal signs of aging because digestive issues, really develop over a matter of years and sometimes even over decades. And listen, I can assure you that the damage is probably caused by some of these health foods, and it's far from normal. The good news is that you can easily help fix the problem from your own home. It's very simple, actually. If you have to know which foods are actually healthy and which contain this hidden potential toxin, you can go find this yourself at gutcleanseprotocol.com/CW. So that's gutcleanseprotocol.com/CW. And you just go ahead and click on the link in the description below this video. Because after years of research, Dr. Gundry has decided to release an informative video to the public for free and interrupted, showcasing exactly which foods you need to avoid all this. So again, go find that video at gutcleanseprotocol.com/CW and click on the link in the description below. All right, so this first case that we're going to talk about is, and again, if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, like the show. Again, my name is Daniel. You can find me pretty much everywhere over at Police Law News. So, all right, listen. So this first case that we're going to talk about, and again, I've gotten more hate from this case than I literally have with any other police case that I've covered in a really, really long time. So, the case that we're going to talk about is the Roger Fortson case, and this actually happened in Okaloosa, Florida. And so I'm just going to get the elephant out of the room right away. Okaloosa, Florida, that is the same law enforcement agency that had the attacking acorns case. So it's important to know that it's the same law enforcement agency. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, there's pretty much what we're pretty sure of is that there's going to be all kinds of comments about that. So it's important just to get it out. However, as far as we know, this is not the same officer. It's a large law enforcement agency. So listen, here's how this came about. So about 3 days ago, I saw that Ben Crump went on national media and he started talking about a case that I wasn't familiar with. It's involving an individual named Roger Fortson. It happened in Okaloosa, Florida. Mr. Fortson was a 23-year-old airman. So he was in the Air Force, and I hadn't heard about this case, but Ben Crump did a couple national media interviews talking about this case. And, obviously, anytime Ben Crump says something, I'm kind of looking at the case like, well, is this true or not? And here's why. So Ben Crump didn't really give a whole lot of information about this case. It is a fatal officer-involved shooting, but he did make 3 very specific claims about this case. And no surprise that all three of the claims that he made the involved police officer just look absolutely terrible. So let me go through what Ben Crump said. So Ben Crump said that police went to the wrong apartment. He said that police did not announce their presence, and also that police forced entry into the apartment before the officer involved shooting. So that's really all that I knew. And some of the other information that he put out there was that, it was a domestic dispute call, but he claimed that the individual, Mr. Fortson, was alone in the apartment, but, right before the police came, that he was on FaceTime with a female from out of state. And then again, the three claims that he made were that the police went to the wrong apartment, they did not announce their presence, and they forced entry into the residence. Well, listen, I saw that, and one of the first things I did after I saw that is I went on to my TikTok, and I put up a story, and I basically said, hey, these are the three things that Ben Crump is claiming, but because of his disgusting history when it comes to lying about these kinds of cases, that we really should not believe Ben Crump without evidence. After I put up that story, it got, tens of thousands of views, and I got so many messages essentially telling me that I'm wrong and that I'm a racist. And again, all I was doing was saying that, hey, Ben Crump has this history of not telling the truth about these cases, so don't believe him without evidence. It was that very next day that the body camera video came out, and I wasn't shocked, but a lot of people should have been, is that the body camera footage that came out actually showed that Ben Crump was wrong, or he lied about all three things that I predicted that he was wrong about. So that's kind of the preamble to this case. Again, I'm really curious about people's thoughts as I go through it. So now that's kind of how all this started. Now I'm going to walk you through the case of what happened, and then I'm going to give my opinion at the end. So we did watch the body camera footage. Most of it is out right now, and here's what happened. So this came in at an apartment complex, and it was a domestic violence call, a domestic dispute. Essentially, this was the manager at the apartment complex who called for police officers and said, hey, here in apartment 1401, there's a domestic dispute between a male and a female. So a deputy with the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office, a couple deputies head to the scene, and at first it's just one deputy. So he actually starts the investigation before his backup gets there. And when police officers go to domestic dispute cases, I think it's important to note that a lot of the time, if someone calls in and says, hey, the domestic dispute happened at apartment 1401, a lot of the times police officers, they just go right over to the apartment. They just go right over to 1401, they knock on the door, and they try to investigate and stuff like that. But that is not what this police officer did. This deputy, he went above and beyond, and this is really evidence of this deputy trying to do a thorough investigation. Here's what he did to really go above and beyond to make sure that he was thorough and had all of the information before he made contact with the individuals who were, the subjects of the call. He went to the office and he spoke with someone at the office because the apartment office are the individuals who called. And the first person he talked to was a male, and he basically said, hey, I'm here for those you guys called. I just kind of want a little more information. And the first gentleman he talked to said, you know what? I'm not the one who called. I don't really know, but let me get a hold of the manager who actually called. The deputy says, okay. And the deputy says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and hang out. So the deputy hangs out for a few minutes. The guy makes the call. The woman who's the apartment manager comes down and she basically tells the deputy what happened, and she tells him the story, and she's leading him over to the apartment, that she actually called about. And basically what she tells the deputy, she says, that there are domestic disputes that happen here pretty often, but today it sounded worse than any other day. And then as they continue to walk, she tells the deputy, 2 weeks ago I was walking past the apartment and I heard a lot of yelling. I heard a male call a woman a bitch, and I heard what sounded like a slap. But we didn't call the police, but we have heard, a history of domestic violence, or what seems like domestic violence, coming from this apartment. So that's what the police officer is thinking. The police officer is thinking, again, not only was there a call of a possible domestic dispute, which happens all the time, but the deputy went above and beyond and actually went down to talk to the person who called and made sure they had physical contact so he could hear right from the person who called what happened. Again, I just want to point out for the third time, this is something a lot of police officers don't do, but it's evidence of a deputy wanting to really be thorough in an investigation. So it's Yeah, it's one of those things, and I also should say that the individual who, I don't think the deputy knew this at the time, but Roger Fortson, he was in the Air Force at the time. There is a military code of conduct, though. Again, I don't think the deputy had that information, that Mr. Fortson was in the military. So the deputies walk into the apartment. He takes the elevator up. He gets outside of apartment number 1401, and again, like I do every week, if I see something that the police officer that I think did wrong, I'm always going to ask questions. So one of the first questions that I have about this is that, as the deputy's walking up to getting into the elevator, the last thing he tells the female apartment complex manager, he says, "Hey, if you see the other deputy, guide them up to where I'm at." So essentially, he's going to this domestic violence call without any backup. And, he's telling the apartment manager to, let the other deputy know where he is. So I have some criticism there when it comes to tactics. So again, that's not illegal for the police officer to do, but to me, the police officer should have waited, especially because this wasn't just like, a random domestic dispute call. Like, he got pretty specific information from the apartment complex manager, who, again, should be a reasonable person. Apartment complex managers typically, aren't in the business of calling police for no reason on the people who live there just for fun because they're bored. Again, that's typically not what apartment complex managers do, because that would be pretty unprofessional. So typically when a professional person who's at work at the time tells a police officer something like this, it would be pretty strange for that person to be lying. Now, of course, anyone could be wrong. Anyone could make a factual mistake. But again, a police officer wouldn't assume that someone like this is lying to their face. So the officer should have said, okay, this could be actually a real call of some kind of domestic dispute. Also, like, they've had cases before where, she's at least telling me that it sounded like there was a slap and there was swearing and yelling. So the idea that, a police officer didn't, the idea that the police officer or the sheriff's deputy didn't wait for a backup, I don't get that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But also, it could be a culture thing. So the police department that I just retired from, it was pretty much a thing where we did ride in one officer cars, but also, anytime you went to a domestic dispute, no matter how benign it might be, you always went with backup. Now, if you got there and the offender left, yeah, the other officer can leave. But, going to an active domestic dispute, always go with a partner. Again, that could just be a culture thing. It was actually in our policy, too, that we had to do that. So that could be a part of it as well. So anyway, the deputy, he walks up to the apartment, and this is the middle of the day. I should point that out. It's not like it's like 3 o'clock in the morning where, most people would be asleep or anything like that. It's the middle of the day, and the deputy knocks on the door pretty hard, not like a light knock. He knocks on the door pretty hard, and he yells, "Sheriff's Department, open the door." He does that twice. He yells that twice. So again, the assertion from Ben Crump that the deputy didn't knock or didn't identify himself is absolutely incorrect. That is just an outright lie, and that is refuted by the body camera footage. So the deputy knocks twice, and he yells, "Sheriff's Department, open the door," 2 different times. After just about a minute or so, minute and 20 seconds, something like that, the door opens. As the door opens, Mr. Fortson is standing there, and he has a gun in his right hand at his side. It's at that point, within a second or so, the deputy, I think he yells "step back," or I don't know what, he yells something, but then he shoots Mr. Fortson. I think he shoots 6 different times. Mr. Fortson does suffer fatal injuries. He does not survive this officer-involved shooting. So those are the facts of the case. That's what happened. And, there really are 2 different issues, and I think it's important to not confuse those issues. One issue is the lies that Ben Crump told before the body camera footage was released. I think that's something that we have to talk about. And the second is, was the officer involved shooting objectively reasonable? Because that's the standard, right? And that's what I'm going to talk about. So it's my opinion that this officer involved shooting is objectively reasonable. This is a legal officer-involved shooting. And listen, here's the thing. I know that a lot of people don't agree with me because, again, I said I've been covering this case the last couple days. I've gotten more messages and disagreement from people than I have on any case. And I have some pretty controversial, it shouldn't be controversial because I'm just talking about what I think is legal, pretty controversial cases I've talked about where I think that the police officer's actions are legal. I'm getting more disagreement and engagement over this case than any other. But I'm also going to say, in case you're new here, if your criticism of my opinion is saying that I am a bootlicker or ACAB, that's fine. That's actually like really lazy commentary. If you don't know anything about the law or policing, or if you failed a police test, in 2007 and you're just mad that you couldn't be part of the team, those are the types of comments that people like that leave. It's not honest criticism. I get that you think it's funny. It's not honest criticism, and that's fine. There's no rule saying that you have to be honest. But again, if you want to have a legitimate debate, explain, hey, this is what the police officer did. This is what the police officer did. This is why I think it's wrong. And then you should point to either law, policy, or training. And if you can't point to law, policy, or training on why you think the police officer did something wrong, then you should really look at your own opinion and you should say, okay, well, I'm saying the police officer did something wrong, but what do I have to back that up? Because everything I'm going to say, I'm going to back up. So we have John Brown saying that he wasn't a threat. Great. You know what? I think that's something that we should honestly talk about, that he wasn't a threat. Okay, so you sitting here in your home on your couch watching body camera footage, you know that Mr. Fortson isn't a career criminal. You know that he's a 23-year-old noble, honorable guy with no criminal history who is dedicating his life to being in the Air Force. You know that. And that's a luxury to have that information. Me sitting here in this awesome studio, I have that information too. So I can look down with 20/20 hindsight and say, yeah, well, Mr. Fortson, with everything I know now, Mr. Fortson probably wasn't going to shoot the police officer because that would be out of character, because I've had several days to look into this case. So I think you have to understand that just because knowing right now I can look down on this case with all of this information and say that Mr. Fortson wasn't a threat, that's different than the analysis from the police officer who had a split second. And you have to at least acknowledge that. And when you're looking at the law on what is legal for a police officer to do, 20/20 hindsight, everything we know now, that absolutely isn't how the law works. So basically what Graham versus Connor says, and Graham versus Connor is what, the law of the land that governs, what is a reasonable police officer's use of force. What Graham versus Connor said is the use of force from a police officer has to be objectively reasonable for what the police officer knew at the time, not what we know now, not 20/20 hindsight. So what is in the mind of a reasonable police officer at the time? And that's what I'm going to talk about. And then we can talk about other things too, but that's what I'm going to talk about. Kuros 234, good question. I'm going to answer that here in a second. So, here's what a reasonable police officer would be thinking. I'm going to a domestic violence call. We have evidence that there's prior domestic violence. We also know that domestic violence calls statistically are some of the most dangerous calls for police officers to go to. I knock on the door really loud and I yell. I don't just say it and whisper it. I yell. Sheriff's office, open the door. So as a reasonable police officer, I would think, okay, I'm going to a domestic dispute. Domestic disputes are dangerous. I yelled sheriff's department, so anyone inside the residence would know that it's police outside, and still this person decides to answer the door with a gun. So a reasonable police officer would see that as a threat. They just would. So I mean, that's the reality of it, is that a reasonable police officer would see that as a threat. For Mr. Fortson to open the door like that, holding a gun on a domestic violence call at his side, a reason. If you think a police officer say like, "Hey, bro, what's going on? We got a call. Would you mind not shooting me with that thing?" So if that's what you think that what like training and policy is for police officers, again, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's obvious obvious and it's reasonable that any police officer would see this as a deadly threat. Now, here's some of the pushback I get, okay? Some of the pushback that I get, and I like the pushback because it's important to have conversations. Some of the pushback that I get is like, well, yeah, the gun was at his side. It wasn't pointed at the cop, so he wasn't a threat. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I've gotten that comment both on TikTok, Instagram, and X probably about 400 times. So it's obviously that's something a lot of people think about in this case. So is that, well, the gun was at his side, so it wasn't a threat. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you, how fast or how quickly can someone have a gun at their side, moving it up and placing a round on target? How fast can someone do that? I know the answer to that. It's about a quarter of a second. So basically what you're saying is that, it's essentially a quarter of a second difference. So really, it's faster than any human can respond. So going from the gun down at your side to shooting the cop is a quarter of a second. So you're saying so I think what people are saying is that if the gun was pointed at the cop, definite deadly threat. The gun at the side, definitely not a deadly threat. And the space between those two opinions is a quarter second. So literally faster than any human can respond. So what a reasonable person would say, well, since you can't respond quickly enough, if someone decides to shoot you, that the level of threat that a police officer should see from a gun pointed at the side to a gun pointed at you, that's just about the same amount of threat. Because again, if someone decides to shoot you and their gun is at the side, or if someone decides to shoot you and they're pointing the gun at you, you literally can't do anything about it either way, because it only takes about a quarter second to go from one place to another. So that's why a police officer, and that's the reality of it. So a police officer is going to see this as a deadly threat. Again, that's just how it is. Also, a lot of people have been asking, let's see, Kuros has a question. Kuros234, hey, answering the door with a gun is crazy. If you want a protection, leave the door closed. Oh, that's such a good thing. So here's what I'm also getting a lot of comments on. A lot of people are saying, well, there are home invasions where people pretend to be the police, and just because you knock and say sheriff's office, like, how does he know if it's the sheriff's office or not? Like any reasonable person would open the door with a gun in their hand. Oh, you know what? Okay, fine. Let's go ahead and John Brown says, I'm sorry, I can't agree with your point. The officer should have waited for backup. Life could have been saved. Hey, John, yeah, he should have waited for backup, though, again, I'm not sure what backup would have done, because opening the door like that, he probably would have had two cops shoot him instead of one. So I'm not sure since the response from the officer was almost immediate, he probably would have had two cops shoot him instead of one. I don't know what that would have done, but I was just making the point that in general, two police officers should respond to a domestic violence call. I think that's an honest thing. It's an honest criticism that I think we should have. But please put in the comments, how do you think it would have ended different if there were two cops there? I'm really, really curious about that. So again, a lot of people are saying, well, there are these home invasions where people pretend to be police officers. So yeah, of course he's gonna have a gun when he opens the door. So I don't see how reasonable that is, and there's a couple reasons for that. Is because police officers across the country literally knock on tens of millions of doors every year. Almost no one answers the door holding a gun. So it's not like this is a common thing, but let's address your concerns about the home invasion. So you're right. So that does happen. So that does actually happen sometimes, again, but again, I think we should put this into context of, what happens in reality, not like Alex Jones conspiracy level kind of stuff, but let's reality. So police officers knock on doors tens of millions of times a year. Across the country, there's, 3 or 4 that we hear about of people pretending to be cops. So, yeah, tens of millions to 3. Again, if that's going to be your argument, that's a little silly. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it's the middle of a day in an apartment complex where there could be, if you let me say this: if you're going to do a home invasion, okay, are you really going to do it in the home invasion pretending to be police? Are you really going to do it in the middle of the day in an apartment complex where there's literally hundreds of other people around, where there's live cameras And again, it doesn't make any sense. If you're a house out in the middle of nowhere or in a remote place and it's at night, that's when we see these happen. Again, in the middle of the day, a nice apartment complex where there's cameras everywhere, that's where you're going to do a home invasion pretending to be police. So again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The conspiracy level here is a little silly, but let's say you're concerned, and I'm totally fine. Yes, of course, Jeremy DeWitt, he's in jail. If Jeremy DeWitt was out and you want to say, hey, we thought it was Jeremy, I'm totally good with that, okay? But let's say you are concerned about whether or not it's a police officer, because I was joking a little bit about the Jeremy DeWitt thing, but let's say you are concerned that it's a police officer, because I'm not saying that should never be a concern. Here's a couple things that you could do. You could look through the peephole, you could look through the window. Now, I'm going to get to this issue in a second, is that the cop wasn't in front of the peephole. I get it, okay. So here's a couple things that you could do. You could talk to the cop through the door, or the person at the door be like, hey, listen, I'm not sure if you're a real police officer or not. Can you go ahead and stand in front of the window? Can you go ahead and stand in front of the peephole? You can at least have a conversation with the person. If the person isn't willing to engage or is silent, yeah, that's probably an indication it's not a police officer. Now, what I can tell you is that most police officers are going to go like, hey, my name is Officer Smith. I'm with this police department. Yeah, dude, I'm right here. But let's say the police officer refuses to do that for whatever reason, even though I'm telling you, most cops are going to have a rational conversation with you because they just want to talk to you, figure out what's going on. Because listen, the last thing police officers want to do is spend an hour and a half investigating a domestic violence call. What they would rather do is clear this up quick so they can go get lunch with their buddies. I promise you that's what police officers would rather do than involving themselves in your domestic situation, okay? So I think it's important to note that also, so the artwork from policing a lot of times is turning, a possible criminal domestic into a civil. If there's a way that police officers can kind of fade it and make it civil and not have to spend, the next 6 hours taking someone to jail for a nonsense misdemeanor domestic, again, like that's what most police officers would prefer to do. They'd rather sit with their buddies behind the 7-Eleven and have lunch and not be, doing a bunch of paperwork on a misdemeanor arrest that is going to go nowhere anyways. I think we all know that's what cops would rather do. So like I said, so let's say you're not sure if it's a cop. The cop refuses to stand in front of the peephole, which isn't reasonable, but probably cop won't stand in front of the peephole. Well, here's what you could do next. You can call dispatch. Just call the non-emergency number and be like, hey, I live here at this apartment complex. I'm at apartment 1401. Listen, there's some guy who's knocking on the door and he's saying he's police. Can you just let me know if there's police outside? I just want to be safe. The dispatcher will tell you immediately if they're there or not. Let's say you don't want to do that. Okay, well, what you can, especially, and this doesn't work all the time, but in this case, it would have. Let's say you're at an apartment complex where there's, literally, obviously, there's an apartment complex staff who's real fucking nosy because they're calling the police on you. So what you can do is you can go ahead and call down to like, hey, this is Roger from 1401. Hey, listen, there's people knocking at my door. They're saying they're cops, but listen, I'm not sure. Is any way you guys can verify for me real quick? So again, there are other options. The idea of like, hey, we're not sure if it's a cop. So even though they said they're a cop, but I'm just going to open the door with a gun in my hand and play this Russian roulette game just for fun. That's not a reasonable response, and it's not what most people do. Again, if this were an epidemic of this happening 100 times a day across the country, well, I can walk down that path with you. Maybe we can have that conversation. And I know that I've told the story before, but while I was working as a police officer before I retired, I was on patrol taking calls for service for just over a decade. I knocked on thousands of doors. There was one time that someone opened the door just like Roger did. They had a gun down at their side. And I was not involved in an officer-involved shooting. And maybe I'll tell that story later. I know I've done it before. I was not involved in an officer-involved shooting, but that was the one time, that was the closest I ever got to being in an officer-involved shooting, which was exactly this case. But again, that just shows how rare it is. I knocked on thousands of doors as a patrol officer for over a decade, and one time someone answered the door holding a gun at their side. So one of the other questions I've been getting a whole bunch, that I've been getting a whole bunch is that, well, the cop wasn't in front of the peephole. The cop was hiding. The cop was being kind of suspicious because he was standing off to the side. Now, listen, I'm going to claim ignorance on this because I thought that this was common knowledge. I'm not exaggerating when I've said that on X and on TikTok, I've gotten literally hundreds of comments of people saying the exact same thing, and that is, why is the police officer hiding from the peephole? Again, I thought that this was common knowledge, but police officers, but again, it's obviously not common knowledge, okay? So police officers, when they knock on a door, they do not stand right in front of the door. Police officers are trained to stand to the side because it's not safe to stand right in front of the door. That's called the fatal funnel. So police officers absolutely do not do that. It's called like a bladed stance. But in the police academy in 2005, when it comes to patrol tactics, I was taught this in the police academy in 2005, that when you knock on a door, you stand off to the side. If there's two of you, you each stand off to one side. And listen, the last, 19, 20 years, the training has not changed. This is constant. So tens of police officers, millions of times a year, knock on doors where they stand off to the side afterwards. That wasn't, strange that the police officers did that in this case. It's not suspicious. It doesn't mean they were doing anything wrong. It's literally how every police officer across the country, millions of times a year, knocks on doors. And again, I thought it was common knowledge, but I guess it's okay. It's okay if it's not. I'm happy to provide that information. If you're a police officer and you're in your field officer training and you're knocking on doors, standing right in the middle of the door, that's the kind of person who actually isn't going to make it off of field training. Okay, so let's see if we have any questions about this. Let's see. So some people are saying it's murder. Okay. Again, I got that comment. I got that comment. A whole lot of people saying it's murder. Well, again, if you're saying it's murder, it's almost difficult to respond to you in a serious manner because murder has a real definition. Essentially, there's intent behind murder. So if you're saying this is murder, basically what you're saying is the police officer woke up that day after working for 10 years, he's on the back half of his career. He has worked 10 years, never been in any trouble, no controversial officer-involved shootings. He's randomly sent to this domestic violence call, and he thinks to himself, this is the one. Whoever opens the door, I'm just going to shoot him 6 times no matter what the circumstances are. Because in order for it to be murder, that's the intent. There's an intent to murder. So if you're saying it's murder, you're saying that the police officer had the intent to kill the person who opened the door, for any reason possible. So again, if you say it's murder, you're not actually a serious person on these issues. All right, let's answer a couple questions. Michael Davis. Hey, Michael. There was no domestic at 1401. If the manager sent the cop to the wrong apartment, that's a problem. If the tenant was alone, where was the domestic? Oh, Michael, that's such a good question. Thank you so much for asking it. Yeah, so it seems like, and I could be wrong, is that there wasn't a domestic at that apartment. From what we know is that the one true thing that Ben Crump said is that Roger was actually on FaceTime talking to a female. Again, how do you get a domestic call from that? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. However, However, the police officer, again, has no reason to think that the apartment manager is lying or is wrong. The police officer still has to investigate. And the way that the police officer investigates is knocks on the door, says that they're with the police department, and just see if anybody answers the door. So I agree with you 100%, but I would say that, the fault has to be on whoever provided the police with the wrong information. Because again, Michael, that's a really good comment. I appreciate it. But the police officers are not psychic, right? If an apartment manager calls in and says, hey, there's a history of violence at 1401, and today the fight was actually worse than any other time we've seen, what's a cop supposed to think? Is the cop supposed to think, nah, lady, you are fucking bullshitting me. I'm just going to go home and have lunch with my buddies behind the 7-Eleven. No, the cop has to go knock on the door. So yeah, I agree that there probably wasn't any domestic happening in there. The cop didn't know that. And again, police officers have to knock on the door and see what's going on. They didn't have any option but to investigate once a call like that is placed. Cage and Randy, hey, how's it going, Randy? Let's see. And it's not safe to open the door either. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and talk about that, Randy. Well, for Roger, it wasn't safe to open the door holding a gun, for sure. But again, statistically, literally tens of millions of people open the door to police officers every single year, and almost never does this kind of thing happen. So again, to say it's not safe, it's actually safer statistically to open the door for a police officer than it is to drive your kids to school. There's way more of a chance you're going to get hit and killed by a driver on the road driving your kids to school than you are by just opening the door for a police officer. But yeah, if you open the door to a police officer and you're holding a gun, again, I'm not trying to sound callous, but this is a predictable a thing that's going to happen. And my thing is, I want this to happen less. That's the whole purpose of this. That's the goal of literally this entire thing. I want less violence between police and civilians. So let's talk about what the police can do better. But listen, I'm telling you, if police officers knock and announce at a domestic violence call and you open the door and you're holding a gun, police officers are going to perceive that as a deadly threat. Now, does that mean every police officer is going to react the same way? No. We see how this police officer reacted. I think it was objectively reasonable. When I was in literally the exact same situation, only it was at night, so it was dark, literally the exact same situation that I was in when I was a rookie, I didn't shoot. I had my gun up. I started the slack from the trigger started to go, but he dropped the gun before I was able to shoot, which I'm so thankful of. But again, like, every police officer might act a little different. It turns out that, this officer, this deputy, he gave Mr. Fortson less than a second. The guy who was holding the gun when he opened the door with me, I gave him about 3.5 to 4 seconds, and thankfully he dropped the gun. So you never know how a police officer is going to react in a situation like that. Looking back on it, I'm glad I reacted the way I did. Now, again, had I been shot in the head, well, then I wouldn't be able to sit here and do the show with you. I'm glad I gave, because it was like a 15-year-old kid. I'm glad I gave him some time. Okay, Cajun Randy, good question. So it's illegal to open the door with a gun pointed down. Great, Cajun Randy, such a great question. No, I don't think it's illegal to open the door with a gun pointed down, but that doesn't mean that it's not that a police officer won't see it as a deadly threat, right? So you can basically have things, so it can be both at the same time, where it's not illegal to open your door like that, but it's also a situation, given the totality of the circumstances, where a police officer might see it as a deadly threat. Let me give you another example and see if this would change your mind at all. Let's say a police officer makes a traffic stop, and the guy, instead of sitting in his car, he gets out of the car, and as he gets out of the car, he's holding a gun in his hand on a traffic stop. Well, is it illegal for him to step out of the car holding a gun while the cop's on a traffic stop? That's not illegal. Like that in and of itself, like, that's not illegal. But category of not illegal, but would a reasonable police officer also see that as a deadly threat? Yeah, probably. So again, two things can be true at the same time, where it's not illegal, but a reasonable cop, given the circumstances, is going to see it as a deadly threat. All right, so let's see. TBMB95. So how do we reconcile having an armed society with you guys? Because the two don't seem to mesh like at all. Well, they do. They do. TBMB. That's actually a really good comment and question. Thank you so much for asking it. So they actually do. And again, I'm just going to point to stats. So, there are, 300 million guns in the United States, 100 million people, at least 100 million people are gun owners, and there are around 1,000 fatal officer-involved shootings in the United States. So, we have 100 million people who own guns. We have 1,000 fatal officer-involved shootings, so that means literally 99.99999% of the time, it is possible to live with police officers working and with the Second Amendment. Now, if you're going to make the argument that 99.99999% of the time isn't good enough, there's not much I can do for you. But no, it clearly is. It clearly is that the two coexist all the time. Now, again, like I said, if this was happening 100 times a day, if 100 times a day across the country, people were opening the door, holding guns, and there was 100 fatal incidents a day, then I would say, you know what, I think we have a problem. But even then, statistically, it would be like 99.999% of the time things are fine too. But again, if this happened more often, maybe we need to have a conversation about it. But even though this is unbelievably, incredibly rare, look at how much time I'm taking to talk about this case, because I do think it is the most important case in the country. And also, I want to say that the people who have questions and comments, especially the people who disagree with me, like the vast majority of the comments and the questions about this case that people are asking, even if we disagree, they are 100% reasonable questions that I think deserve to be asked, deserve to be answered, and that we should have a debate about it. I honestly think that. All right, let's see. Kevin Taylor says, what about Philandro Castro? Yeah, Kevin Taylor, you know what? I'm not crazy about the Philandro Castro case. I think that a police officer in that case should be prosecuted. And as it turns out, that officer was prosecuted. So I think that case probably went just like it should. Let's see. A Cajun says, then why shouldn't see a deadly threat when we see a cop with a gun? Cajun Randy, last question about this, maybe. All right, so then why shouldn't we see a deadly threat when people see a cop with a gun? Okay, well, again, let's think about that. So what you're saying is that a police officer walking around, going to his car after leaving a gas station, and you're driving by and you go, deadly threat, that's a deadly threat. If you can articulate that, again, let's go ahead and do it. So again, to me, that's a little dishonest. That's kind of like juvenile troll level question as opposed to the other ones, which were really good questions. So again, it's like police officers have legal authority to arrest people. You may not like that, but that's the law. Police officers also can use force and show a force in order to affect those arrests. That's part of the powers that police officers have. So again, it's a different scenario. Also, I would say if a person is just walking around and they have open carry and they have a gun holstered, that's not a deadly threat. Of course not. But again, it's the totality of the circumstance. So when I'm saying it's the totality of this exact circumstance of why the shooting was objectively reasonable, and then your response to that is, oh, so anyone holding a gun is a deadly threat. Again, you can say that, but that's literally not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying this is a very specific set of circumstances. It's a domestic violence call. Domestic violence calls are dangerous for police officers. The police officer knocked and announced. The police officer would believe reasonably that anyone inside knew that they were a cop. So now the cop has to think, this person who's, possibly the suspect of a domestic violence knows that I'm a cop and is still coming to the door holding a gun. That would be what's going through the cop's mind. And again, you and I have, 40 minutes, 2 days, a week to think about this. The cop had less than a second to think about it. So again, it's different. But again, saying, oh, so now anyone carrying a gun is a deadly threat, that's really dishonest. No one is making that argument. And there's clearly a difference. Let's see. Okay, Cajun Randy, cops want to be the only one with a gun. Okay, all right, I keep saying last question. No, Cajun Randy, that's actually not correct, and I've got some evidence for that, and I'm going to do it in a story, and then I'm going to transition to something else. Okay, so there's an idea that police officers don't like the citizens to have guns. It's actually ridiculous. It's nonsense. Again, it's conspiracy level stuff, and again, I'm not just saying that. Here's the evidence that I'm going to cite to. So back last September, again, I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I just retired from the Albuquerque Police Department. Back in September of last year, our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, under the health order, under like the COVID health code, she decided that she was going to put in some gun restrictions. Essentially that like you couldn't have guns in public in Bernalillo County. And the way that she was going to try to go around the Constitution in order to do that is she was using the health code. She was basically saying that gun violence in New Mexico, specifically in Bernalillo County, the county that I live in, that essentially it's so violent that it's a public health issue. So she tried to basically put this thing, and basically she was trying to make it illegal to basically carry guns in public in Bernalillo County. That's what she said. Within a couple hours, and again, you can Google all this stuff. I'm not making any of it up. ABQ Raw is a great website. If you check out ABQ Raw and type in like New Mexico gun grab, like all the articles will come up, okay? So basically what happened is within a couple hours of Michelle Lujan Grisham, the governor of New Mexico, putting that out, basically saying to police officers, hey, you need to enforce these gun laws. Within a couple hours of that, our police union, I know people on here don't like police unions, our police union, the Albuquerque Police Officers Association, and I was a board member of the Albuquerque Police Officers Association at the time, we put out a public statement and we sent it to all the media, all the local media here in Albuquerque, and we basically said, hey, this is unconstitutional, and police officers in Albuquerque do not want to infringe on people's rights. This is unconstitutional, and we're asking you to rethink it. So that's what the Albuquerque police officers did. There's a really great YouTube channel called 2A Cops, basically cops who like the First Amendment. I actually had me as a guest on their show, and I talked about this on that show right when this was happening. And again, I highlighted basically, essentially what I just said. So there's a lot of people who say that cops don't like people that have guns. Well, again, here is like an actual thing that I was a part of. It happened in my city. The governor tried to pass some unconstitutional unconstitutional, not laws, just like these decrees under the public health order. The governor tried to do that here in my county. Immediately, the Albuquerque Police Officers Association didn't care what the chief of police said, didn't care what the governor said, didn't care what any of the legislatures in the state said, and we put out this public statement saying this is unconstitutional and we are not going to enforce these laws. We didn't know what the consequences could be, but that's how the Albuquerque Police Officers Association, that represents the police. Doesn't represent anything else. It represents police officers, and that was the public statement that we put out. So again, in reality, that's what happened when a governor tried to do something unconstitutional when it comes to grabbing guns. That's how police officers responded, and I think it was a good response. I actually think it was a model response for any other place where governors try to do this. All right, so that was the last question that I was going to take on that case. Again, we're going to be following this case. My prediction is that the police officer will not be charged because it's incredibly obvious that this was a legal and reasonable officer-involved shooting. Thank you so much for all the comments and the questions on this. I think that was a really good discussion. I think I hit just about all the issues. And again, you can go ahead and follow me over at Police Law News. I'm going to be covering this case, pretty much over the next couple days and stuff like that. So I'm going to talk about one other case briefly, because up until the last couple days, I thought that I was going to be leading this. What was going to be leading was the Frank Tyson case. So Frank Tyson was a case that happened in Canton, Ohio, last week, and I honestly thought, okay, I'm going to get ready. I'm going to come on the live show and I'm going to talk about the Frank Tyson case, and that's what we're going to go to battle about, and that's what we're going to have a debate about. But instead of that, this Roger Fortson case happened. But let me just tell you about Frank Tyson really quick. So Frank Tyson case has happened a couple weeks ago in Canton, Ohio. We have the body camera footage. Essentially what happened is Mr. Tyson is a 53-year-old guy. He was driving around. He was driving around drunk. He crashed into a light pole. After he crashed, he fled the scene. He ran into a bar, and police officers were called. Police officers in Canton, Ohio were called, and they basically went to the scene. They saw that his car was crashed into a light pole, and witnesses were saying, yeah, he actually ran over there right into that bar. Police officers go into the bar. As soon as they open the door into the bar, like the door isn't even halfway open, and the lady who works there, the employee at the bar, she starts yelling at the cops, and she points at the guy, who was the offender of the crash, Frank Tyson. She points at him and she goes, "Can you get him out of here?" So, after the crash, he was causing a disturbance in the bar. So basically what the police officers do is they try to get Frank Tyson to come outside. They don't immediately start hitting him or punching him or tasing him or using force. They don't even try to really arrest him at that point. All they're trying to do is to get him outside of the bar. And they're trying to do that for a couple reasons. One, he was just involved in a crash where he hit a light pole. Listen, this guy could have injuries. So the police officers obviously want to make sure that he's okay. Also, when you crash and you run from the scene, a lot of times you're drunk, right? So police officers want to conduct an investigation for driving while intoxicated. It's much easier to do that, if you're not inside of a crowded bar. And also, this is private property, and you have an employee saying, "Can you get him out of here?" So there were three reasons why police officers were trying to escort Frank Tyson out of the bar, which again was legal and reasonable to do. Because here's the thing, if police officers wanted to, as soon as they made contact with him, they could have placed him under arrest, thrown him in handcuffs, and just got him outside immediately. That's what they could have done. Instead of doing that, they their first thing was, okay, hey man, can you just come out and talk to me outside? So Frank refused. He refused. He said he wasn't going to go outside. So obviously police officers can't be like, oh, okay, well, here we have a drunk driver who crashed, fled the scene, caused a disturbance in the bar. The bar manager doesn't want him there, but he doesn't want to leave. So, all right, well, you don't want to leave the bar, so I guess we'll just leave you here. Have a good one, guys. Obviously, that's not what police officers do. So police officers each grab one arm, and they get physical, and they try to grab him and get him outside. Again, they don't take him to the ground. They don't hit him. They don't strike him. They don't tase him. They don't shoot him. They each grab an arm, and they try to escort him outside. Literally the lowest level of force you could possibly use. And Frank is screaming and yelling, screaming, "Get the sheriff, get the sheriff." Obviously, he's not making any sense. He seems like he's drunk out of his mind, doesn't know what planet he's on. I'm talking about like George Floyd level intoxicated. I mean, it's nuts how drunk he is. So he starts resisting arrest, and the police officers, eventually they all go to the ground. Now, here's the thing about fighting with someone in a crowded bar. It's not as easy as it seems, and here's why. Fighting with someone out in the open, okay, there's really no weapons that people can grab most of the time. If you're out in the open, there's no one else who's going to get injured. But if you're fighting with someone in a crowded bar, there's tables, there's chairs, there's beer bottles. Again, there's all kinds of stuff that he could grab. that makes it dangerous, not just for, I mean, who knows? Morgan Wallen could be in that fucking bar with a chair. You just don't know. I mean, so there could be a lot of different things that make this specifically dangerous for police officers, and also more dangerous for Frank Tyson. Again, what if they're wrestling him, and as they get him down to the ground, he hits his head on a chair? So the whole time, they're really trying to make, again, it's not an easy thing to do to fight someone in a crowded bar. You're going to have to take my word for it. It's not easy. So what the police officers do, they actually are able to get him into custody. Now, here's the thing. They're able to get him into custody without shooting him, without tasing him, without using a 40 millimeter, without using a baton, without using pepper spray, without punching him, striking him, or kicking him. They are able to get a disruptive drunk guy into custody in a crowded bar without doing any of those things, just by wrestling him to the ground. That's a win. That's really good. There are a lot of police officers in a lot of different places who wouldn't be able to do that, but they do that. That's fantastic. They actually get him into handcuffs without causing any injury at all, and that's what we want. That's how we want to go. Now, what the police officers did, and again, like I do with every case, if cops make a mistake, I'm going to call it out. Here's their mistake. After Frank Tyson was in handcuffs, they left him in a prone position. They left him essentially laying on his stomach. He does say, "I can't breathe." Eventually, they notice that he's not really moving around at all. They check on him after a couple minutes. He's not breathing. They start medics. They do 7 minutes of CPR. Frank Tyson ends up dying. That's the case. It's pretty controversial. Someone died in police custody. It should be controversial. Again, I can list all the things that Frank Tyson did wrong. He drove drunk. He crashed. He caused a disturbance in a bar. He didn't listen to cops. He fought with cops. All of these different things he did wrong. And yes, what the police officers, in my opinion, did wrong is they left him in a prone position after he was in handcuffs. I don't know if it was just the adrenaline, if it was just like, oh my God, we got this guy into custody. Like, we're happy with what we did. We got him into custody without injuring him. That's great. But they left him prone. I don't know how many times I have to say it. Don't leave people prone. Once someone is in handcuffs and it's safe, get them on their side. Sit them up. Stand them up. Do not leave people prone. What we know, and I don't know why. I can't say why. Positional asphyxia is the word that's thrown around a lot. I'm not in the medical field. But here's what I do know. That when someone is drunk, high, or has medical problems, putting those individuals on their stomach handcuffed for any period of time, for whatever reason, there's a certain percentage of the time that the person dies. I can't say why. I just know that it happens. Again, with the Albuquerque Police Department, we received that training, I think, in the early 2010s. Could have been 2012, could have been 2014. I don't remember the exact year. What I do know that it's been at least a decade. And the Albuquerque Police Department, we do have good training, but we're certainly not on the forefront of every advanced training out there. My point is, if we know this in Albuquerque, you know this in other places. And we knew it a decade ago. I don't know how many more videos like this we have to see after you get someone into handcuffs and it's safe. Roll them on their side. Sit them up. If someone says, I can't breathe, even though 99% of the time it's bullshit, if someone says, I can't breathe, just fucking believe them. Once they're in handcuffs, once it's safe, sit them up. Roll them on their side. The cops messed up. They should have. Now, does that mean the cops committed a crime? No, of course not. Absolutely not. 100% the police officers should not be charged in this case. But yeah, is it an error? Is it going to be a civil case where there's some kind of a judgment? Fine. Obviously, I don't think that the police committed a crime in this case, but was there some type of error the police made? Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not expecting police officers to be 100% perfect, but by this time, we know to sit people up, to roll them on their side, to literally, especially when you have fat, drunk, unhealthy, horrible people who are acting out of their mind, leaving them prone, handcuffed, is a recipe for disaster some percentage of the time. Guys, please, I'm begging you. Roll them over, sit them up. I don't know what else I can say about this case. All right, let's see if we have any questions about this case. Let's see. Even if they are combative. Oh, Lindy, thank you so much. So, Lindy, yeah. So, if they are combative, so let's talk about that. So, once someone isn't, so I said made safe. So let me specify that, Lindy Lou. Thank you so much for the question. So if once someone is in handcuffs and police officers have checked to make sure they don't have any weapons, at that point, yeah, I think no matter what, you should sit people up or get them on their side. Now, again, if they're kicking you and stuff like that, throw on leg shackles, same thing. The goal should always be to get someone on their side or sitting up. If someone is combative, again, like I said, they're handcuffed. You have someone getting leg shackles. If someone is combative and you have two cops there, even if a third cop is getting leg shackles, there's no reason why you roll them on their side. One officer kind of holds the dude's shoulders. The other officer kind of holds the dude's hips or legs. Most of the time, two cops can handle that. I guess what I'm saying is that police officers should at least be working towards or, look like they're working towards the goal of sitting them up, putting them on their side. In this case, and I get it. I've been in fights as a cop. It sucks, okay? And afterwards, you have an adrenaline rush, and you're not always thinking straight. But, after it was obvious that Mr. Tyson in this case was no longer combative, he was in handcuffs, they let him lay prone for a couple minutes without checking on him. He wasn't combative anymore. So again, once it's safe, handcuffs, and you make sure someone's searched, then the next step in the process is doing different things to achieve the goal of getting them on their side or sitting up. Again, now let's say someone's thrashing and kicking and there's only two of you there. Cool. Awesome. I get you not be able to do it in that situation, but get on the radio. Hey guys, can we have another officer swing by with leg shackles? At least do something to make it seem like, hey guys, listen, we are working towards this goal of getting him sitting up or on his side. Just leaving him prone for a couple minutes without checking on him. And again, I don't think the cops are bad people. I don't think they did this intentionally. I don't think they committed a crime. I think it was an honest mistake after a really dynamic situation. That's what I think. Hey, Lindy, I get it because no one wants to die. However, it's a scary situation, I believe anyways. Yeah, it is. No, it absolutely is. It's absolutely a scary situation. And again, a lot of police officers had this training a while ago. I don't work in Ohio. I've only been to the state of Ohio one time in my life when I was a kid. We went to Cedar Point. So again, I don't know anything about Ohio police training. I'm just guessing that if we had it in New Mexico a decade ago, hopefully they've had it in Ohio. So again, I don't think these cops are bad guys. They obviously had no intent to hurt Mr. Tyson. The body camera video shows their intent was literally to do everything to get him into custody using the least amount of force humanly possible. So my guess is they weren't sitting around, what we're going to do? We're actually going to take this combative drunk guy into custody. We're going to go out of our way to use as little force as possible. And then at the end of it, we're going to make sure he dies. Obviously, that's not what the cops intended to do. This was a mistake. It just wasn't on their radar for whatever reason. That's one of the reasons why I cover cases like this, not to just justify the bad actions of police officers, but to, try to get police officers to think, okay, after someone's in handcuffs, like, hey guys, you're not done. There's something else you need to do. All right, listen, that's going to be our live show today. I really appreciate all the questions and the comments. I know that the cases, especially that first case, Roger Fortson, that was a controversial case, and let me tell you, it's not the last time that I'm going to be covering this case. It's an important case. A lot of people are talking about it, and a lot of people should be talking about it. So again, I hope that everyone has a great weekend. Please go ahead and follow the channel, and make sure if you haven't subscribed to Cop Watch TV, please go ahead and subscribe. I just want to say Happy Mother's Day out there to everyone out there. I hope everybody has everyone has a great weekend. And one of the most important pieces of advice is don't go to jail on Mother's Day. Get her some flowers instead. And all right, everybody have a great weekend. Stay safe. Thank you.